Now that we've created the UV map in Maya, we're going to open it up inside of Photoshop and generate a texture map similar to the one in the finished model here to the right. So I've started by opening the UV map, and once I've done that, I'm going to go to my layers, and I'll lock the transparency, hit D on the keyboard to get the default black and white, and I'll choose Option Delete to fill it. And that just makes it a little darker and easier to see. I'm going to start with a gray layer, so I'll generate a new layer, Command-Shift-N, or you could go up to Layer New, or you can click on the new layer icon at the bottom of the layer window. I'll go to my swatches. In my swatches, I'll go to grayscale, and I guess I'll pick something that maybe is about 50% gray. Anything to give it a color that is, or a value that's similar to what we'll end up with. And I'll fill that blank layer, and I'll move the layer below the UV map. Now the model is pretty much comprised of a pattern, a metallic plate with rivets around the perimeter. We're going to define a pattern that will allow us to map pretty much everything here with the exception of the details of the eye and the flames around it, and maybe a little color on the prop itself. But this will be the driving texture for our model when we're done. Put a new layer in. I'm going to get my rectangle marquee. I'm going to set my marquee tool for fixed size at 6 inches by 6 inches. And on the blank layer, I'll click anywhere in my document window. And then I'm going to turn off the UV map. In my swatches, I'm going to choose 45% gray, and I'm going to fill that selection with that gray. And in the layer window, I'm going to double click, and I'm going to put bevel and emboss on. And once I put the bevel and emboss on, I'm going to choose inner bevel. I'm going to choose a depth of 700. I'm going to choose a size of 5, and making sure the softness is off. I'll click OK. Now while I'm still selected, I'll right click and choose Transform Selection. I'll hold down the Option and I'll drag in so I get a smaller rectangle inside the existing one. Now, this point I'm leaving maybe about 1/8 of an inch. This is pretty subjective on how small you'll make that. Just bear in mind we're going to put little rivets around the perimeter of that as well. I'm going to make my percentage 80%. Otherwise you can do this by eye. And I'll hit Return on the keyboard to set that. Zoomed in, you can see now we've got a selection that is the same proportion of the original file or the original layer, and it is in a smaller scale. Now I'm going to copy and paste that to its own layer. And I could hit Command-C, Command-V, or I could hit Command-J. And now I've got the bevel and emboss on this new layer. Now our objective is to put some rivets around the perimeter of this. Now we're going to duplicate that smaller beveled box one more time, so I'll hit Command-J. Now I don't want this shape on the layer, but I want the bevel and emboss to be on it. So I'm going to go to Select All, and I'm going to hit Delete. What we have now is a blank layer with the bevel and emboss on it. Now I'm going to hit B for Brush, and I'm going to set my brush hardness to 100%. I want to scale this down. I could have done that in this window, or I could have gone to the upper left-hand corner of the option bar and chose the size there, but I'm not sure the size I want. So I'm using the open bracket next to the letter P to knock it down and scale. And I'm going to drop the scale down to 15. Now what will happen is because I'm painting on a layer that's got the bevel and emboss, when I make a mark, it gives me the bevel on it. And you can see it's starting to look like a rivet. I'd like this rivet to pop a little bit more. So I'm going to put an outer glow on it, or perhaps a stroke. I'm going to go to FX, and I'll put in outer glow. I'll make sure that the color is black. Change the blend mode to multiply, 100% opacity. And I'm going to make the size probably 5 or 6. And I may drop the opacity a bit to about 75. Now we want a consistent line of rivets all the way around. Before I try to do this by hand, I'm going to go to Window, Brush Settings. In the brush settings, down at the bottom of the menu, you'll see spacing. This is kind of a subjective approach. I'll make the spacing 200, and I'll click where I want to start. Holding the shift, I'll drag across. And I'll do that for all the sides. And we should have something like this. Now with the riveted plate created, I'm going to use Define Pattern to generate a number of these. Holding down the Command key, I'll click on the very first box we created, the one on the perimeter, the larger of the. I'll go to Edit, Define Pattern, click OK, and I'll deselect. When putting a defined pattern into our file, we have to create a layer for it because it will cover up whatever layer is selected. I'll start by putting a new layer in. Then at the top of the user interface, I'll click on Edit, and I'll go to Fill. I'll navigate to the Pattern tab in Contents and click where it says Custom Pattern. And the last entry will be the riveted plate I just created. Now if we were to take a look at how this was applied to the actual UV map, and we look at the finished product, you can see that the same pattern has been used consistently throughout the design to apply to that UV map. So now I'm going to use this same pattern, scaling it from large to small and putting it in pieces that I think are appropriately would use a smaller pattern, like perhaps the foot and the tail and perhaps the arm of the weapon. I'll start by putting it where the body shows up for the character. I want to be able to see through this as I scale it. So I'll put my UV editor on. I'm turning on my UV map. And now I can go to the layer with the pattern and I can scale that down. I'll hit Command T on the keyboard. And subjectively I'll start maybe by scaling this one down to about, maybe 40%. And now I'm going to start to place it where I want. Now, depending on where your UV map is, you'll want to avoid crossing over into other pieces that will need their own separate UVs. So now that I have the general scale that I want, I'm going to replicate that layer. I'll hit Command J. And I'm going to hit Command T, flip it vertical. And I'll drag this up. I want to keep that pattern consistent. And now that I've got two of them, I'm going to merge them down. And that means now I've got what I need to cover the body of this. So zooming in on it, I'll hit L on the keyboard. Using the polygon lasso tool, I'll make a very rough edit around the shape I want to cover. And as long as I'm not interfering with any of the other UV references, the wing on the left, the tail wing also lower left, the eyeball, the foot, any other elements that will require me creating a pattern of a different size, I'm trying to avoid by eliminating it with this selection. Now when I click on my layer mask icon, it will appear only on the geometry that I want it to. I'm going to hit Command S to save. I've opened up Maya and now I'm going to attach my texture map to preview what I've done thus far. Selecting any piece of the geometry of the model, I'll right click and choose Material Attributes. And in the channel box, I'll go to Color under Base and I'm going to right click on the word Color, Break Connection so I can add my new texture. Following the tab at the end of the color slider bar, I'll click on the checkerboard pattern, choose File, and I'll navigate out to my texture and I'll apply it. And now I can see how it falls in the context of my model. Now I could go back in and adjust this, and perhaps I will. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to duplicate the layer in Photoshop and I'm going to apply it to some of the other pieces of geometry. I will come back once I've completed all the texturing of my content in my model. Now in Photoshop I've completed all the UV maps, and if I were to look more closely, each of the UV maps has a piece of texture comprised of that pattern in different scales, and each has been applied using a layer mask to edit out where I didn't want the shapes to actually fall on other pieces of geometry. Now I'm ready to return to Maya. Returning to Maya, I'll select my geometry and I'll go to the material attribute, and clicking on the tab where we accessed it from our desktop and clicking on the word reload. And I can see where my texture lies now in the context of my model. Next, we're going to add a little bit of personality to this by putting an eye on it, color on the tips of the shoes, and some colors on the tail and perhaps the propeller. Before I start applying the eyeball and some of the colors I want for the model, I'm going to gather up the layers in Photoshop that comprise the metal texture. And at the bottom of the layer window, I'm going to click on the group icon, which looks like a little folder. And I'll name it Metal Plates. I'll hit Command-Shift-N or create a new layer, naming it I. And I'll zoom in to my UV map where the eye appears. Hitting M on the keyboard and changing it to the elliptical marquee. Holding down the Option and the Shift, I can drag out and define the shape I want. I'm going a little bit beyond the edge of the actual UV map. Anything outside the UV map has no geometry to apply to, so it's not visible. In my swatches, I'll probably open a pastel and I'll start with the yellow. Color is really up to you. The process is really all it's about. I'm going to turn off my UV map for a moment, because with that shape now, what I'd like to do is put an inner glow on it to add a little bit of color to this. Now, once again, this is optional as well. I'll click on Inner Glow, and I'm probably going to use a little bit of red, so he's got a little bit of a bloodshot eye, perhaps. I'll set the blend mode to multiply. Opacity I'll put up to 100% at first, and I'll just change the size of this to kind of engulf a little bit more of the area. Now that I have kind of what I want, I'll drop the opacity a bit. Now I need a pupil. I'll start by making a selection of the actual eye itself. Holding down the Command key, I'll click on the layer named eye and the marching ants around the perimeter. I'll put a new layer in, and I'll name it Pupil. And I'll hit M on the keyboard to go to my marquee. If I right-click, I have the option to transform the selection. Holding down the option, I'll click and drag into the middle to make a smaller circle. This is subjective as well. I'll hit D on the keyboard to give me black on my foreground color. Holding down Option Delete, or using the paint bucket or a brush, I'll fill in the shape of the pupil. I need one more circle for the white that would be appearing if there were a reflection on it. Once again, I'll add a new layer, call it Reflect, and I'll move the selection to the bottom right a bit. Right-click inside, I'll choose Feather, and I'll put a feather of 10 on, and I'll right-click and choose Transform Selection, and I'll just make it smaller. And now I'm going to fill it with white. Now I could use the Command key, or I could put the white on top, use a brush or paint bucket. And I've got a little bit of a white reflection. I'll drop the opacity a bit, maybe to about 60%, and I'll save. Next, I want to put some flames around where the eyeball would be. Now, in order to locate the plane in which you would want to place this element, you'll need to go to Maya and then find the face in the body in which the eye will be showing up, which is this one right here for me. The way to do that in Maya is to go to your model and in your UV map have it available, and then right-click and choose face and select the face that you know the flame is going to be on. And I can see it's located here. Now I can return to Photoshop and I can put that texture in. Again, I'm going to put a new layer in. I'll use my pen tool. If you wanted to, you could use your lasso. And you just want to make something that looks like perhaps a flame of some kind. And if you're not competent or comfortable with the pen tool, you could have done this with your lasso. So I'll make one side with my pen tool and the other side with the lasso so that you can see that as an option as well. I'll make the selection, and I'll start by introducing a color I might want. And I think I'll probably choose a pastel orange. Again, this is all very subjective. Now I need one for the other side. In this instance, I'll use my cowboy lasso tool. And with my cowboy lasso tool, I'll create a shape similar to that. I'm working on its own layer. I don't have to worry about the scale of it until I actually finish it, and then I'll place it in its proper position and scale. I'll fill that with orange, and I'll deselect. Now I want to scale it to fit the UV map. I'm going to use an inner glow on this as well. Double click. I'll place the inner glow. And I think I'm okay with that, perhaps something a little redder. And perhaps I'll reduce that size. I'll put some noise on it maybe. And I think I'll put a stroke on this as well to give it a bit of an outline. I left it at 1. I'll click OK. Now I'll turn off my UV map. Hit Command S to save. And I'll go into Maya and reload my texture to see where it lies. And you can see what we've got now. Now I'll provide a texture map of the finished model for reference, and then you can complete the rest of the color work for your texture, and the end results will be the fully colored model.